Hey everybody. It is Friday, 9:45 Central Time. If you're out there, feel free to say hi in the chat. I'll try to watch that. So this video is going to be a little different than, most of my videos as far as topics and format and all that. I will try to touch a little bit on, personality types, psychological types, that cognitive functions, um, but most of this video is going to be a little different. And, it obviously relates to the Charlie Kirk situation and his assassination earlier this week. And I think, and really just sort of what I'm hoping to be an objective, detached sort of assessment of the way that I see things unfolding here in front of us, and what I think the different positions are on each side, and maybe an explanation for it. Because I think a large part of the problem is the arguments haven't really been framed properly, or maybe the underlying principles of the arguments aren't really framed properly. And I think maybe framing them or understanding where they're coming from might help people at least talk about it or talk through things. A little bit of general housekeeping. This is not intended to express any sort of political viewpoint on my end. I obviously have my own opinions on things, and I probably will share those throughout, but the purpose of the video is more about explanation, I hope, and less about what I think personally of the various topics. So be that as it may, I mean, obviously this is, everybody's going to have an opinion. It's very important to at least to those of us in the U.S. And I'm hoping again that maybe framing the arguments in a particular way or sort of showing where they're coming from might help with just maybe a general understanding and opening up, a way to discuss this in maybe a more productive manner. But hopefully it helps. Okay. So to start off with, I think it's important to understand this concept of a performative in linguistics and in philosophy. And usually when somebody uses the word performative, they use it in the sense of, oh, that guy's, his speech or, what he's saying is just performative. Like it's inauthentic. He's just sort of putting on airs. He's just saying it, but he doesn't really believe it, but he just wants everybody to sort of believe him. So it's performative in that way. He's sort of performing, what he's saying. But that's not what I'm talking about here. That's a very different, that's a different concept. Or a different use of the word. A performative, at least in the original sort of linguistic philosophy sense, and I think the guy who came up with it, his last name's Albert. I should have looked that up, but I'm pretty sure his last name's Albert. So you can look this up for yourself. So here's the basic idea to explain the concept. Because it's a concept that's best explained through sort of thought experiments or examples, real world examples. And the idea is that there are certain elements of language or uses of language that create reality. And just by the language itself creates a certain reality, but it's very heavily context dependent, and that's going to be important. And I'll explain how that works in a minute here. So here's the example. So if a priest at a wedding says, "I now hereby pronounce you husband and wife," he is saying it, it's language, it's the declarative statement and utterance. But by virtue of the priest saying it, it actually creates a husband and wife marriage, right? At least, in the traditional church, Catholic Church, or, you know, and the idea is it's the context, right? That because the priest has a certain authority, that at least those who follow the church and and recognize sort of the church's proclamations, it creates the marriage, right? So not only does he just say it, but by saying it he makes it true. Okay, that seems a little banal and like obvious, right? And so why do we care? And and I'll get to that in a second. But I want to point out that it's very context dependent because it depends on everybody sort of recognizing the context in which it's said and who's saying it. And so, for example, let's say you have a priest, he has the full authority of the Catholic Church, he's an ordained priest, but he goes rogue. And this is, my concept of the rogue priest. And he goes around town, just out on the street and just starts picking people at random and says, I hereby declare you husband and wife. I hereby declare you husband and wife. And just picking, average, just random people and declaring them to be married. Now, does that mean that they are now technically married? I mean, again, it's coming from a priest who's ordained and has the authority. But at least for those of us in the US and probably in the West in general, in most countries in general, we would say, no, that's outside of the context, right? That's outside of a formal wedding ceremony. And we have freedom of religion, at least in the US. And, people don't have to just follow what the priest says. And so just because the priest says it doesn't necessarily make it true. However, in the context of a marriage in the Catholic Church, where everybody sort of agrees, to the general rules, if the priest says, hereby declare you husband and wife, then now you have a marriage. Okay, so that's a very important concept that is going to, we're going to expand on that. But you have to understand, how, what the performative utterance means, and B, how it's context dependent. Okay, quick aside, just for the psychology nerds out there, the reason this was important, the idea of the performance utterance, it came out in the 1950s, and in the 50s there was this classic battle between the behavioralists and the cognitivists, or the cognitive psychologists. And there was this whole debate about whether the mind actually exists or it's just sort of this illusion or epiphenomenon, but we don't really need a mind. The behavioralists would argue the mind is just sort of this thing that happens, but we don't really need it. We're really just stimulus response machines that are, trained through, conditioning and learning throughout our life. And we're really nothing more than just sort of fancy calculators. And the idea that there's this sort of mind out there is just sort of a byproduct of it, but it doesn't really do anything. Instead, we're just like calculators. We're put in a stimulus, you get a response. Put in a stimulus, you get a response. And that's technically what the brain/mind is doing. And then there was a whole other school, the cognitivists or the cognitive psychologists, who said, no, there really is this mind, this thing, the mind, and it really is doing something. And the performative was an example of that. And this idea of context was very important in early cognitive psychology, because if context drives what is happening, then there's something more than just stimulus response. So if you think of a calculator, calculators don't have performatives. A calculator does not make something the number 4 just by virtue of pressing the number 4, right? I can't, take 3 oranges and turn them into 4 oranges by virtue of just pressing a number, right? On the calculator. And so calculators don't shape reality. They just sort of reflect computation, input output through an algorithm. And that's basically what the behavioralists believed, that again, the mind was just sort of the stimulus input output algorithm kind of thing. But the cognitive psychologists come in and say, no, 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 no. There's more to the human mind, the human experience than just input output. And they would, point to things like performatives, right? You can actually create reality by virtue of your words and what you're saying. Okay. Like the example of the priest formally marrying people by declaring it. Okay. And so that was just, so again, just a quick aside, that was just an example of how the cognitive revolution sort of beat out the behavioralists. And there's other examples, but that was sort of a big one. Okay, so now here's sort of I think the baseline understanding or example it's very important to understand, to understand the larger context of where I'm going with this. And it's another example of a performative utterance that I think really explains the phenomenon. And if you get this sort of thought experiment or example, it'll be easy to understand where I'm coming from with this argument. And think of a baseball umpire calling balls and strikes. So, and let's imagine a scenario where it's a very important baseball game. It's like the bottom of the ninth, and the home team is down a run, and bases are loaded, and you have a batter up with a 3-2 count, and so he's one strike away from striking out, and there's 2 outs, and so very important call, right? And and if it's a ball, he walks, and they score a run. If it's strike, he's out, and they're out. Okay, so you get the context. Very important. Let's take the umpire. He makes a call on the pitch, and he calls a strike. Batter's out. Game's over. Okay, they lose the game, and let's say it's the World Series. They lose the World Series, and they will forever be known in the record book for having lost that game. And whoever was up at bat will forever be known as striking out and losing the game. All because of what the umpire called the strike. Okay. And let's say that, there is let's say, difference of opinion from all the fans at the game and the coach and the batter. They think it was clearly a ball, but the ump called a strike. And the ump's not going to change his mind. That's what he saw. And, let's assume, he's being perfectly objective. He's calling what he thinks he saw, and he saw a strike, and he called a strike. But then let's say, we go back, we look at the replay, and we have the advantage of, robots and computers and all that. And it was clearly a ball. It was clearly outside. It was not in the strike zone. And every objective viewer would say that was clearly a ball. Okay. But it doesn't matter. In the record books, in the history of the game, that was a strike because the umpire called it a strike. Why was it? And so even though in reality, quote unquote, it was a ball, in objective reality, everybody agrees and any third-party observer sees it as a ball. The computers and robots all say it was a ball, and in reality, it was a ball. But in the other quote unquote reality, the reality of baseball and the reality of the statistics books and the reality of whether or not this team lost the World Series because they lost that game, and whether or not they were able to, whatever economic benefit, whatever cultural benefit, everything that would have stemmed from winning the World Series, that never manifested, that never occurred because of this one call. Okay, so the umpire, through his utterance and his authority and the context, shaped reality. Okay, and we use that term all the time, calling balls and strikes, and it has sort of a deeper meaning if you really think about it. In this sort of philosophy, linguistics sense of the word, that you could shape reality through words, through utterances, through what some might call the umpire's opinion. Now, he might say, that's not an opinion. That's what I saw. I saw what I saw, and it was a strike, and I don't care what the robots or whatever say. Or he might come back and say, oh, I guess, looking back on it, I was wrong, but it is what it is, and that's what I called. And, and I, that's legitimately what I saw. And so he shaped reality. And that's a very important concept here, that the brain and the mind, given whose brain and mind it is, and given what the context is, can shape reality. Okay. And it's also important to realize that if the coach goes out and disputes it, he can't shape reality. He doesn't have the authority. His performative, quote unquote, utterances don't matter. Neither do the fans. The fans riot and set the place on fire, doesn't matter. And even the batter, so unless you're able to change the umpire's mind, which probably isn't going to happen, your opinion does not shape reality. Only the umpires does. Okay. So now let's think of a concept of a rogue umpire. So let's say there's a rogue umpire out there that really doesn't care about the game or his job or his duty or obligations to the game. And he just decides one day, I'm just going to call every other pitch ball or strike. So the first pitch is a ball, second pitch is a strike, third pitch is a ball, so on and so forth, just alternating between ball and strike. And I don't care really what it was in quote unquote reality. I'm just going to call it that. And so now his utterances, assuming you don't have a riot and he doesn't get pulled out of the game and everybody just sort of goes along with what the ump calls, and or nobody picks up on what he's doing or something like that, he has shaped reality that has nothing to do with objective reality, right? But he has still shaped reality through his utterances. Okay, this rogue umpire. And clearly, I mean, if people understood what was going on, noticed what was going on, they're not going to take it, right? They're going to say, hey, this guy shouldn't be in this position of authority. We're going to boot him. And I don't know what would really happen in that concept, that they just put in another umpire or what. But, there's only so much that people are going to take, and so we don't have to necessarily agree with these performative utterances if we think that they're not made in good faith or being made in bad faith, or they're just sort of, randomly called, or in this case, algorithmically called. Um, but it also would point to, if a larger bit of what I think is going on sort of politically here. The fans and the players and the coaches, I mean, you could clearly understand how upset they would be. What you're saying has no reflection of reality, Mr. Rogue Ump, and we're not going to take it. We're going to strip you of your authority, and your ability to sort of quote unquote shape reality here. Okay. And that's why we get so frustrated when, umps make the wrong call, or referees in a basketball game make the wrong call, because we're powerless. We, in general, is, unless it's a clear case of somebody going rogue, like the example of like the NBA refs who were betting on the games, or sort of playing with players that they didn't like, refusing to call fouls, that kind of thing. And we have this sort of visceral emotional reaction to it, right? Because it's not fair. And they are not living up to their duty or their obligation. And they might just say, "Hey, it's just my opinion. I didn't think there was a foul," or, "Hey, it's just my opinion. I didn't think there was a strike." And, we don't buy that. We don't buy that concept when somebody's given this level of authority. Okay. However, that's an extreme case. In most cases, we just have to go with it, right? We just have to accept that's what the ref called, that's what the ump called. It sucks. We're going to spend the rest of our lives on sports message boards debating whether it really was a foul, or whether it really was a strike. But we accept the reality, as fans of the sport, and then players of the sport, coaches. We'll generally accept that's just the reality, even though we don't agree with it. We have to accept we lost that game, or we lost the World Series. Okay. But it does frustrate us to no end. And why does it frustrate us? Because we have no power. We have no power to change, the outcome, or the reality that was shaped by this performative utterance, right? Okay. So I think that's enough belaboring the example. But let's take it sort of, let me step back. So in this idea of the performative utterance came out, again, it was sort of in this philosophical linguistic context, and the cognitive psychologists sort of ran with it, and other things, to sort of prove there's this mind that is context dependent. And so if it's context dependent, it can't just be stimulus response. The behavioralists had their own arguments that, context is just itself, stimulus response, but that's not the important point here. The important point is that it became this concept that sort of spread through lots of academic disciplines. The idea of the performative language. And it's been a little sort of bastardized, because people are sort of conflating it with the idea of lying, or being performative, unauthentic, that kind of use of the word. But it also has sort of these underpinnings in a lot of academic, theoretical paradigms, constructs that pop up all over the place. Like the idea of a social construct. Now, I think the idea of the social construct was sort of around before performatives, maybe. I could be wrong. But it sort of fit hand in glove with the idea of there really is no reality. It's just kind of, what we collectively agree the reality is, right? Um, like there really is no such thing as a race. It's just we have this social construct of a race. We've all, as a society, sort of agreed that people who look like this are grouped into this race, and people who look like this are grouped into this race, and it's all just a social construct. I'm not voicing any opinion on whether I agree with that, but that was kind of the idea. Same thing with gender um, and you could see how this concept sort of proliferated through various academic disciplines. This idea that language shapes reality. And there really is, and some people take it to the extreme to where there's really no objective reality. It's just sort of, we've all just sort of agreed that those in power, those who are the umpires of whatever system we're living in, whatever political or religious or cultural institution we find ourselves in, those who are the umpires or the priests who are sort of ordained with this authority create our reality through their performative utterances before what they declare, through what they declare is true and what they declare is not true. And we just have to take it. Or, we can fight the system and say we're not, gonna, adhere to your performative shaping of our reality any longer. And so then you get to the idea of the power dynamic, and this is, very much out there in the blogosphere, the social discourse out there of, everything is just a power struggle. And if you look at the world through that lens, that our world and our reality is shaped through these various performative utterances by people in power. And, and in general, we are just fans watching, passively watching the game, and we have no say on the matter. You could see how that sort of shaped the political discord and where we are. So clearly there are examples of performative language. We do it all the time. We make laws, and by writing it in to the statute book and writing the regulations or amending the Constitution or whatever we do, we're using language to say what is and what is not legal or allowed, permitted, and thereby, quote unquote, shaping reality, sort of shaping um, our culture and what we live in, our environment that we live in. So let's take an example, which is obviously a very hot button topic, the Second Amendment. So there's this argument that, again, taking a step back and looking at it through this sort of performative utterance lens, that by virtue of having the Second Amendment, we have those who had the authority, the founding fathers, to write the Constitution, shaped reality by creating the Second Amendment. And, and again, this is their argument. I understand there's arguments against this, but, bear with me. And therefore, created this country that has guns And if they hadn't adopted the Second Amendment, maybe, not necessarily the case, but maybe we'd have a country without guns, or at least, in the hands of the civilians. We don't know if that would necessarily be the case, but their argument is that we at least do know that having the Second Amendment created that reality. And in their argument, and I don't know if they necessarily articulate it this way or necessarily think about it this way, but the argument basically boils down to, hey, we used words on the Constitution written down and created this reality, and all we have to do is take those words away, and we change the reality. Now, of course, the counter argument is, no, you don't. You might change the reality for the people who are willing to follow along with the rules, you know, but you're not necessarily changing the reality in total, because there might be people who aren't willing to follow the rules. And that's the whole argument of, if you take away the Second Amendment, then only the criminals will have the guns because they're the ones not following the rules, right? Okay, so, taking away, and again, I'm not trying to get into an argument or share my opinion of whether or not we should have the Second Amendment, or where it came from, or, whether it's a divine human right to be able to own a gun or not, or if it was just the only reason we have a right is because somebody decided to write it down on a piece of paper and it's all performative. I really honestly don't have much of an opinion on that either way. It's sort of leading one way or another, but that's not the point of this video. The point of the video is to understand that's the framework that that one segment of the population sees as reality. That, again, we live in this sort of bastion or interconnected network of social constructs that the people in power have created through their performative utterances. And the reason they're able to create this reality is because they're the ones in power. They're the ones that have the authority to do it. They are the umpires. They can call balls and strikes. Okay. Where there's a whole other viewpoint that says, no, these, and it's the idea that these are just opinions and everybody has the right to share their opinion. And the opinions don't shape reality. They are just opinions. They are just these ephemeral ideas. And yeah, it might eventually get codified, materialized into a statute or a law or a policy or an executive order or some sort of rule that we have to follow. But until that happens, they're just ideas, and we should be able to freely discuss our ideas in a open and democratic system. And it really isn't until we actually put it on paper that these really have any sort of manifestation in reality. Like we are not creating reality through our ideas. We are merely describing a potential reality. But just by describing it and talking about it doesn't make it so. These are not magic spells that just because I say the words does not make it true, does not make it reality, like a magic spell would, right? By saying the words, you summon the demon. By saying the words, you shoot off an electric, lightning bolt from your wand or whatever. That is, words don't have any real direct bearing on reality until You go through this sort of formal process and make it into a law or a policy. And that's the whole point of debate and discourse and, and the news and the media and all, all the stuff that we're surrounded by is to just sort of sort out the ideas. It's a quote unquote marketplace of ideas. So that's one argument. That's one side of the argument. The other side is, well, no. If you are in a certain position of power, your ideas have more weight and are more likely to quote unquote create a reality than somebody who's not in that position of power. Like poor little old me. All I've got is my little YouTube channel. Or whatever the case may be. So let's take another example here. And I think the Joe Rogan phenomenon really illustrates this. Okay. And I like it because he talks about this directly. And I think it sort of underscores the sort of disconnect between the different frameworks that people are looking at things. So there's this whole argument, hey, we need, that Joe Rogan is platforming people, putting people with quote unquote bad ideas on his show and sort of, and again, if you're one of these performative social construct type people, he is sort of shaping reality by allowing people with certain ideas on his show. Now, of course, he all the time will say, hey, this is, all I'm doing is just expressing my opinion and allowing my guests to express their opinion. And again, it's just the marketplace of ideas. We're just putting ideas out there. What we say on this podcast has no bearing on reality because I'm just a simple caveman comedian. What I say, doesn't really matter. And the funny thing is, it's like, that's how it started. And it was very true, at least, I don't know, when he started 15, 20 years ago. He was literally just, putting this podcast out by recording him and his friends, getting stoned on his couch at his home and just bullshitting and, just a bunch of comedians just being guys and, bullshitting. And of course, it had no real effect on reality other than just sort of pure entertainment purposes, right? But they weren't shaping reality in the sense of like an umpire would, right? They weren't calling balls and strikes. Whatever they said had no bearing on anybody, and nobody had to pay attention to it or worry about it. But he is in a very different position right now, right? He's or has been at least the number one podcast in the world. And he is in large part the quote unquote media, whether he likes it or not. And whether, and he'll keep saying, hey, I haven't changed anything in what I'm doing. It's just me talking to people, having interesting conversations, and we're just bouncing ideas back and forth. So again, he's taken this, hey, this is just free market, or, the marketplace of ideas. We're just, I let you put your ideas out. I put my ideas out, and we sort of let everybody else decide, what they think is the better idea. The people on the other side, again, I'm not saying whether they're right or wrong, but this is the framework of their argument is no, 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 no. You are now in a position of power. You are now an umpire. You literally have, the powerful, the people of power, Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, big politicians that actually do shape policy and write down policy and shape our, our our government reality. And not, and just people from all over different areas of our culture. And you now are an umpire, whether you like it or not, whether or not you agreed to be an umpire. You woke up one day and, I don't know how it happened, but you're definitely in a very different position than what you were when you started this. And it was just you and your buddies getting stoned and bullshitting. Now, you might have some episodes where it's just you and your buddies bullshitting, but those episodes now carry weight. And you definitely carry weight when you have, Donald Trump on or whatever. And so now all of a sudden you can't just be an umpire that says, it's just my opinion. I thought it was a ball. It could have been a strike, but it's my opinion. It's a ball. You share your opinion and then we'll figure it out. No, 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 no. That's not how it works. Right? I mean, that's the argument. I'm not trying to say that's what I believe, but that's the argument. Okay. And, in the sense that a coach, you don't have a coach and, if an umpire calls a quote unquote bad call, you don't have a situation where the coaches go out and the umpire discuss with the umpire, and then you come up with what you think a reasonable solution would be. Well, it's kind of a half ball, half strike, so we'll give him half a strike, half a ball, or something like that. It's just what the umpire decides. Okay, because he's in that position of authority, and we've sort of, as a culture, bestowed upon him that level of authority to shape our reality. Okay. And so he has to take it seriously. He's got sort of, what might come close to a fiduciary duty, these obligations to the game. And that is what a large segment of the population, whether or not they articulate it this way or even think about it this way, it's kind of the underlying idea of their argument. You're now an umpire, and what you say and what is said on your podcast is shaping reality, whether or not you want to admit to it and whether or not you want to accept it. It is the case. And that is why there's such a push to quote unquote cancel people that they don't agree with, that don't agree with their sort of ideas that they're trying to put out, or that have ideas that are different, because the argument is, okay, you're in this position of power and we don't think you should be in that position of power. You're not taking it seriously, or it's, we think we should be the ones, right? Now, of course, the counterexample that I think, the people on Joe Rogan's side that see this as, the marketplace of ideas would be, well, create your own podcast, right? We live in a free country for the most part. You should be able to just create your own podcast. And if your ideas are better than mine, or better than the guests that I have on here, then you will win the marketplace of ideas, and more people will listen to your show and agree with your ideas than listen to my show, right? So go out there, nothing's stopped, and he is the example that you could start on your couch with your buddies and get to the place that he's at if people agree with what you have to say, or like what you have to say, or maybe disagree with what you have to say, but want to still tune in because it's presented in a way that captivates them or interests them. And if you think that my ideas are wrong or my guests' ideas are wrong, then go do it yourself. You could be an umpire. You could find yourself in this position. And again, the other side, on the other hand, would argue, no, 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 we're powerless. You have all the power. You have this big deal with Spotify, and for whatever, and you've got President Trump and Bernie Sanders and all these politicians, and he tries to do both sides of the aisle. Obviously, not both sides are as willing to be on the show. But the other side, the non-Joe Roganites, I guess we'll call them, the anti-Roganites, would say, no, 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 you've got all the power, and we can't compete with that. And yeah, maybe you got lucky and you didn't intend to get to where you're at, and you're just one of the lucky few that started on your couch and ended up in this position. But that ship has sailed, and nobody else is ever going to do it ever again. And so now you just have to accept your role and play by our rules. And again, the argument here is, by putting those ideas out there, again, they are shaping our reality. I mean, I think they literally believe this, whether or not they admit to it or think about it this way, or would articulate it this way. It's the underlying assumption, or the underlying sort of principle, that if you're in this position, you're a quote unquote umpire in our culture, you could call balls and strikes. And we think there are certain calls, or there are certain performative utterances that shall never be made, because once you light that fire, it's going to spread. And so we have to stamp it out, because if, again, it's kind of this idea that they are these magical spells, and if you say the words, you're going to create this reality. You're going to summon the demon, literally summon the demon. We're not talking metaphor or figurative speech. You are literally going to shape reality through your words. And we have to stomp out that fire, that little kindling of a fire. And of course, the free speech advocates would say, no, these are just ideas. We are not summoning any demon. We are not casting spells here. We're just talking. They're just ideas. And if you think we're in a position of power, okay, but it's a free country, and you can go talk about your ideas on your own platform with your own people. And again, if the populace or the citizenry agree with you, then you'll win. You'll become the popular podcast or the popular show, and and you will be in this position of authority to shape reality. But again, there's the other side. No, I'll never have the power. You have all the power. And, the only way we can get the power is to take it from you. We don't want to compete with you. We just want to take it from you. Okay. It's kind of the idea. So, Charlie Kirk. We see a lot of, or at least I've seen a lot of these reactions on TikTok and whatnot, that is trying to say this as diplomatically as possible without getting into a whole thing or argument. But there's a lot of reactions that come across as victim blaming, right? Like, you were the one saying all this hateful stuff, or you were the one advocating for gun rights, and blah, 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 blah. And so you shouldn't be surprised if this happens to you. Kind of victim blaming, kind of a fuck around, find out kind of argument. And but I think they're trying to say something else, but the way the words come out and the way they express themselves, and probably even the way they're thinking about it, quite frankly, I'm not trying to say that they're saying something that they don't believe or aren't thinking, But I think they're just framing it wrong or thinking about it wrong, in the sense that I think what they're trying to say, and I'm not trying to defend anybody here, just trying to point out what I think the framework is. I think what they're trying to say is that he is part of the system that shaped reality through his opinions because he was in a position of power. Through his influence on the media, he clearly had influence on Trump and getting Trump elected. So he was an influential person. And I don't think anybody can objectively say he didn't have power or influence or some level of authority. He didn't have political authority. He didn't have, he wasn't a representative, any sort of official capacity. But he was clearly, influential, through the media, through his relationships with politicians, the people who actually have the authority and the people who are actually officials. So you can't hide and just say, he was just some random guy with an opinion. You know, he wasn't just sort of your average small town newspaper editorial writer. He had some gravitas, no doubt about that. But whether or not he and those sort of in his orbit or in his circle who agree with him, sort of his side of the aisle, so to speak, was shaping reality through his words in summoning the demon by casting these spells through his utterances. I mean, that's kind of the idea, I think. You created this reality, is sort of their argument. You were in a position of power. You created the argument. You sort of allowed the Second Amendment to stay in place. You could have used your authority and your power and your position to advocate, getting rid of guns. Now, of course, he would argue that wasn't going to work anyways, but those on the other side would say, hey, this is the reality that you created, or at least accepted, and didn't use your power to change. So it's not necessarily victim blaming. Kind of is, and I'll admit that. But I think they're trying to make a different argument, and so if you look at the different lenses, the different frameworks, on the one side you have the free speech people. These are just ideas. All we're doing is sharing our ideas. We're not casting magic spells. We're not summoning a demon. These are just words. These are just two people sharing their opinion. And if you have a different opinion, by all means, please express it. And if it's strong enough, and if people sort of agree with it as an ethical principle or a reasonable way to sort of shape society or policy, then it'll win. It'll win in this quote unquote marketplace of ideas. As long as we don't have the government or any other official or institution or organization coming in and sort of picking one side or the other, just sort of letting everybody freely debate and letting all the ideas out there, the best idea will win. And that's the free speech side of the argument, the Joe Rogan, Charlie Kirk side of the argument. It's not conservative versus liberal. It's a way of thinking about what speech is, what language is, what ideas are. And that's it. And so you always hear Joe Rogan say, I'm not a conservative. I've never been a conservative. I've never voted for a Republican in my life up until, I don't know what he's voted. But, he is a very like a lot of us Gen Xers feel this way, that like we sort of stayed steady in our political opinion. Like we have the same political opinions as we did when we were 15, but the whole world has shifted past us in one direction or the other. And so now, what used to be a liberal is now sort of a conservative because everything, the whole political spectrum has shifted so much. And he feels, he's in that sort of camp and doesn't see himself as a conservative. I don't think he's a conservative. I mean, in the true sense of, you know, um, policy making. I mean, he's clearly an environmentalist. He's, if I had to guess, he's pro-choice. At least more so than your hardline conservatives are. But anyways, again, I'm not trying to make arguments here or political arguments, but just try to point out that he doesn't see this as a conservative versus liberal thing. He sees this as a free speech versus non-free speech thing, and I agree with that. I think he is right in that, and I don't know if he necessarily thinks about it this way or articulates it this way, but I see it. This is the way that I'm sort of framing it and seeing it. So he's clearly you know, everybody has the opportunity to go make their own podcast. And if your ideas are more, resonate more with the populace, then you're gonna have a more successful podcast than me, and you'll get all the guests that I'm getting, or maybe even more. Okay. Is again, as long as everybody has the equal opportunity to do it, and you don't have some governmental entity or other sort of special interest coming in and putting their thumb on the scale, so to speak, or oppressing your ability to say what you want to say on your podcast. That's very important. That you do have to have that. Of course, the other side of the argument, or the other argument, or the other framework, the other way that people see it is, well, free speech is dangerous because this idea of speech is performative. And if you allow things to be said and you are in a position of power, then you are basically calling balls and strikes with our culture, our political institutions, our cultural institutions. And whether or not you like it, you could there could be this thought experiment of, somebody wakes up one day and they're an umpire, some sort of Kafka-esque kind of story where they never wanted to be an umpire. They never trained to be an umpire. They didn't go to school to be an umpire. They know nothing about baseball, but they wake up one day and they're an umpire and they got to call balls and strikes, and they are shaping reality through their calls. And whether or not they like it, there they are, right? And so if you find yourself in that position, you should take it. You should either abstain, remove yourself from the position, and just say, "Whoa, I'm not doing this. I'm not going to have." And for a long time, I think Rogan tried to do that. Like he wanted to sort of didn't want to bring Trump on, I think, or at least if he did, he wanted to bring both sides. And I don't know. I think he tried to sort of abdicate that responsibility, but at some point he sort of crossed the Rubicon, right? And he sort of became the umpire, at least in this lens, right? This way of viewing the world. And it's not really a free market of ideas if there is this power imbalance, So, this goes back and forth, right? And then the Rogan supporters would say, well, the only reason there's a power imbalance is because you guys are making the power imbalance by trying to stifle speech. If you would just let, speech be free, and let there be this marketplace of ideas, there wouldn't be any stifling, right? And we could just let the quote unquote market decide, and back and forth, but that's the framework. So going back to Charlie Kirk, um, you could see how some people that have this umpire calling balls and strikes performative view of the world could take it to the extreme. And honestly, I don't know the motivations of who allegedly shot him. As of today, I think they have him in the suspect in custody. And I haven't looked at anything about what his political beliefs or anything like that. So I have no idea what motivated whoever shot him to do it. And I'm not even going to try to hazard a guess or put out a theory. I'm purely talking about the reactions of people who had nothing to do with it but are just observing what happened and their quote unquote opinion on the matter and what they're out there saying. And those and so there are people who are probably on the extreme end of this, words have effect, words cast spells and summon demons if you are in a position of authority. There, the extreme side of that is taking this argument that they're creating their own reality, and if they had just listened to us or just had the same opinion as us, they wouldn't be in that reality and they'd be fine. Sort of the argument. And then the other part is, they taking the position that, there is no real free marketplace of ideas. It's all just this capitalistic, paternalistic, colonial system that only the people in power can really share their ideas. And if you want to be in power, you have to take it as opposed to compete with them and try to win in the quote unquote marketplace of ideas. Because again, under their assumptions or belief, there is no real marketplace of ideas. And free speech is sort of a myth. It's only free speech if you're in power. But if you're not in power, you just have to sort of take what they call, take what the calls. It's not like everybody gets to play umpire and the person who has the best call wins the argument. So I don't know. I mean, it's kind of a first principles debate. I think it probably is a first principles debate on how you view the world, how you think language shapes reality, power dynamics, power structure, and all that. But it all came from this relatively banal concept of the performative that was really just kind of there to, in the sort of philosophical sense, this, what is the mind? Is it really a thing that has some sort of active role? Or is it this epiphenomenon and we're all just fancy calculators? But it's shaped our political discord, the way academic institutions, the way people see the world, the way that people interact with the world, and some of these concepts probably go back to everything goes back to Aristotle and Plato, everything, and you could probably map on one side of the argument to Plato and one side of the argument to Aristotle, but we are definitely neck deep in it right now. And I think those who are concerned about everybody just sort of being at an impasse and not listening to each other, and these sort of factions that have developed, and how bitter and spiteful everything is, that are looking for maybe a way forward, maybe a way to, I don't know if necessarily resolve our differences, but at least not let them boil up to, you know, chaos and whatever. Um, I would like to think if people understood where the arguments are coming from, they could talk about and discuss them with with more good faith, and not just sort of pointing the finger at the other side and calling them delusional. There certainly are delusional people on both sides. Nobody's arguing that. But as a general philosophy and a general difference of frameworks, understanding where the other side is coming from, I think, is very important, and seeing it from their perspective. You don't have to agree with it. You just kind of have to understand it. And then you can discuss it on sort of first principle grounds. And, whether or not you've got evidence for your side, or if you think it's the more rational side or whatever, you're at least arguing in good faith, right? And maybe being a little bit more constructive. I don't know if we're necessarily going to resolve anything. There's clearly people on both sides that have their heels dug in, and they don't want to hear any argument whatsoever from the other side. And okay, but they're by and large not the people who are gonna have any real effect on anything other than just sort of, you know, get everybody's feathers ruffled, drum up the base. And I don't know. And also maybe understanding the framework. I mean, I think it just sort of pulls you a little bit more towards the center, and not being as sort of disillusioned about it. Um, because I do think it's important to understand that, there really is this difference of first principles. And I get it. Some people will argue, and the only reason the other side thinks that way is because they have the privilege to think that way. If they came from my background and in my culture, socioeconomic status or whatever, they would see the world the way that I do. And I get that. I mean, maybe that's true. Maybe that's true. But at least, discuss it in that framework, right? Discuss it as, hey, the only reason, the reason you're seeing the world that way is shaped by your experience and where you came from. And if you just sort of remove yourself from that and think about where I'm coming from, then maybe you'll at least see my perspective, and we can have a constructive conversation about it. Okay. I think that's all I really had to say. I understand this is probably pretty pedantic, especially for such a hot button topic, but I think it's important to see where, at least in my opinion, this came from and where we are. Who knows where we're going to be? But hopefully everybody can be constructive and not disillusioned and too enamored with their framework, the way they see it. I think we all have our opinions. I think we probably all fall on one side or the other, or we're just completely indifferent. That's fine. If you want to be indifferent, but just don't get in anybody's way. Um, but if you find yourself on one side or the other, you know, That's fine, but you know, understand. I, I hope everybody understands that, it's just like the cognitive functions. The people have different cognitive functions and have different personalities because of it, or ordering of cognitive functions. Um, I have my theories on which side is, but I don't want to get into that. I don't want to get into a whole debate over which cognitive functions are driving which viewpoint. I'll save that for another day. Things are too hot right now to be getting into useless arguments like that. All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you later.